Okie doke. Well, let's get started. Thank you all for joining. I really appreciate it. I want to start with some quick intros. First, a little bit about me and Pilot. I'm Waseem. I'm Pilot's CEO. Pilot provides finance, accounting, and tax services for high-growth startups. We're actually the largest startup-focused accounting provider in the world. We work with over 1,500 startups of all stages at this point, ranging from pre-seed to Series D. We've run the financial back office for companies like Scale.ai, Airtable, Lattice, a bunch of other folks, so we can support folks through a number of stages. And then I'm a 3-time founder myself, so I definitely know how painful this stuff is and how important it is to get right. And I'm excited because today we're here to talk about the investor-founder relationship and really making that work and getting to yes with your investors. And that's why I'm so excited to be joined here today by Jess Lee. Jess is an investor at Sequoia Capital, where she partners with early stage founders. She's on the board at Moss, Ironclad, Maven Clinic, and a bunch more. Prior to Sequoia, she was the co-founder and CEO of the fashion app Polyvore, which was acquired by Yahoo in 2015, and at PM for Google Maps. She's also a founding member of AllRaise, which is a nonprofit dedicated to improving diversity in the tech industry. She has a degree from Stanford in computer science and loves manga, drawing, bacon, and cosplay. So happy to have you here today, Jess. Did I miss anything on that intro? How did we do there?
No, I think that's good. Thanks.
Terrific. Well, folks, feel free to ask any questions you have as we go using our Q&A tool, and we can answer those live at the end of the session. And then other than that, I will stop talking. I'll let Jess drop some knowledge here on you.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining. The topic of my talk today is how to get to yes. That's yes from a fundraising perspective. So how to get to yes from your investors. And there's a lot of content out there on this topic, tons of great blog posts on how to run a process that's tight, how to make a good pitch deck, how to, kind of run it like almost like an auction, which at the end of the day kind of is. But I wanted to focus on something that I don't hear talked about enough, which is founder investor fit. So, I'm sure this is the image you're all thinking about when you think about fundraising, but I share it because I actually think it's a very apt analogy, right? When you pick an investor or when an investor picks you, it really should be a two-way fit. It's a long-term marriage. It's, two people coming together and spending a very long time together. So I actually think marriage is a very apt analogy. I was talking to Waseem about this earlier. I think he agrees. Like this is someone you're going to spend potentially 5 to 10, even longer, that many years with. And are you going to be, I think Waseem's criteria was, is this someone you're going to be excited to get a text from each week? Because that is actually how often you speak with, your seed, your Series A, and your later stage investors. So I just want to go into a little bit more about why it's marriage. And I think one of the biggest reasons is that it is a type 1 decision. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the type 1, type 2 decision-making framework, but the basic idea is this decision reversible? If the answer is yes, which it often is for most of the startup decisions you make, right? Like, should I ship this feature? Should I change this UI? Like, oftentimes you can do that thing and then you can actually change your mind later. Like, you can roll back a feature, right? You can test the UI, A/B test it, and then, pick the one, roll back the version that didn't work well. So most of the decisions you make are type 2. This is actually, sorry, this should probably be flipped, but this is type 2. And you decide quickly and you act, and then you figure it out, and then you roll back if needed, right? And most startup decisions are this way. However, there are a subset of decisions that are type 1, which means it's actually not that reversible and you have to think very carefully. So a good example is pricing. Where if you roll out pricing to a pricing change to your entire user base, it's actually not easy to roll that back and be like, just kidding, I want to raise prices by 10x like 2 weeks later. You just can't do that. Or I want to change the unit of pricing. Just kidding. That's very hard to do. And so tends to be a type 1 decision. Picking an investor and getting an investor on your cap table is 100% a type 1 decision. That's very difficult to reverse. And, at least in marriage, there's the possibility of divorce. It's very hard to kick someone off your cap table. So it's almost like marriage, except you can't get divorced. So anyway, I want to spend most of this time on thinking about this as how do you get to yes? Yes, I do. And it's a two-way street. How do you get to that mutual yes? So I think about it as founder investor fit. And by the way, feel free to ask questions along the way or chat, whatever you need. And Waseem, feel free to interject in any moment. You have a ton of thoughts on this. You've done this 3 times. So yeah.
I won't be shy.
All right. So I'm just going to break it down into 5 sort of tips. Know thyself, know your audience, sell the problem, sell the dream, and 2-way diligence. So in the great words of philosophers Socrates and Drake, you should really know yourself. Like, first you need to figure out, look inside to see what you need to figure out what you should seek in your investors. So some things I encourage you to think about are, what are your spikes? What are you really good at? And can you find someone who gets you, right? Like, there's nothing worse than being in a relationship with someone who just doesn't get why you're special. It's to really think, like, is it your technical prowess? Is it your deep understanding of the customer? Is it this grit or resilience? Are you super creative consumer, come up with the next big thing that it doesn't make any sense to anyone else, but does to you and then it works? What are your gaps? What are you not good at? Are you a little too conservative? Are you a little too much, take too much risk? Do you really just not know how to manage people because you've never done it before? What do you not know or not know how to do? And can you find someone who fills these gaps? What are your values, right? I think as you think about your company, you write down your core values. In the moments where it's not clear what to do, you're going to fall back on a set of behaviors and values that drive your decision-making. Is your investor aligned with that, or at least adjacent to that? It'll make those tough moments a lot easier. Like, if you tend to fall back on, move fast and break things, let's just say, right? Like, if you have an investor who's completely the opposite of that, who's actually, I think we should do a little more analysis, and think really carefully about everything, you're just going to run into these, you're going to butt heads. What are your biggest unknowns, right? I don't mean your unknowns personally, but the unknowns in the company, right? Like, maybe you're a medical device and you don't know the FDA clearance process. Like, how do you find someone with that expertise, right? Who can make that part of this amorphous, difficult, hazy part of your business just much more clear. And then lastly, what do you know to be true? And this is particularly true of your customers, right? Like, does your investor understand your customer? Do they believe in that thing that you know to be true, right? That maybe for Pilot, it's that, I don't know, founders should be focused on running their businesses and not thinking about the back office all the time. Versus there are some people probably think, actually getting those things right, are very important for you to deeply understand and do every single thing yourself. Don't find that's not maybe the right fit. So just know who you are, right? Oh, you're not going to find someone who's perfect. Just like you cannot find the maybe perfect spouse who's ticks every single one of your dream image of the person you want to fall in love with. You maybe need to pick and prioritize which of these things matter the most. If you can get one of them that's a great fit, 3 of them that are pretty good fit, still that's great. So don't look for Mr. Perfect, Miss Perfect, which is often why some people don't get married. So don't be that person either. All right. The next one, know your audience. You got to understand who your customer is, who you're pitching to, in order to be able to figure out how to land, how to get to yes, right? So I'm going to first talk a little bit about investors in general, and then I'm talk about how to research the specific investor you're talking to. So this is so Sequoia. We have a series of founder programs as part of. We think about this concept of company design, how to design a company right from the get-go to be an enduring company. And one of the courses that we teach as part of our programs and our sort of our version of an accelerator called ARC is we talk about fundraising and we talk about customer personas. So this is a slide taken from that program on if you had to break a VC into a persona, a customer persona, just like you probably might have customer personas for your different, who you're selling into in the enterprise or who your consumer is. Here is a persona of a venture capitalist. And it's very generalized because, this is a short talk. All right. So Vera, the VC, is a 28 to 50-year-old partner at her VC firm. Over the 10 years of her career, she will make 15 to 25 investments in startups. She loves working with founders and enjoys the intellectual stimulation of learning new markets. So think about that. The important part there is 15 to 25 investments, right? as a founder, you make tons of decisions all the time. Imagine if you could only make 15 to 25 key hires, right? In your entire career. Like, you're going to think about that decision very differently than maybe some of the decisions you make day to day at your startup. All right. So 3 pain points that VCs tend to care about. First, returns, right? That's how we're measured. That's our job. However, venture has a power law distribution. Just one rule of thumb, a third of investments will go to zero, a third will break even, and the remaining 1/3 need to make up for everything else. Actually, I think that the real stats are actually worse than this, but just use that as a rule of thumb. It's often quoted this way. So if she's at a good fund, she aims to produce a 10x return on the fund, right? So this means if it's a $10 million fund, needs to return, $100 million. So otherwise, she's hoping for a 3x just to stay in business, right? So just think about that. You are walking into this knowing that 15 of the 25, let's say, people you hired, people you picked, are like, it's not going to go well, and most of them are not going to return capital. And then there's going to be 3 out of 10 or whatever, that 30% are going to make up for everything else, right? So that causes you to think about upside maximization, not downside minimization. That is an important thing to ground yourself in as you're thinking about how to talk to venture capitalists. Second, reputation. It's hard to stand out. Vera needs to differentiate herself. She has, in some ways, some options are you're an expert in this space. You only do robotics. One is to build a personal brand or a blog where you talk about, like, here's what I know about building companies, or here's the topics I care about. Or you just want to maybe be awesome, be known for being really awesome to work with and have a great reputation with founders. Then the third thing is uncertainty. And founder life is incredibly uncertain. I would say I had tons and tons of existential stress consistently all the time, but there's a different kind of uncertainty with venture. The weird thing is, you don't really know if you're good at it for a pretty long time. The feedback loop is very slow. Like, imagine if you shipped a feature and you didn't know for 5 to 10 years if that feature worked. That's like a totally different kind of job. And the other thing is, things can change very quickly, right? Companies that seem to be working can suddenly fall apart. That happened in COVID for sure. Or they can suddenly start working, especially on the consumer side. Like, you make one little feature tweak and suddenly you're taking off. That's true of marketplaces as well. So that type of uncertainty is just sort of weird to deal with. So anyway, that's who you're dealing with. Your customer is like, is this company going to be one of the 3 out of 10, or has the potential to be one out of the 3 out of the 10 that will make up for everything else? Reputation risk, like, is this someone that I can, believe in, count on, who will help my reputation in some way? And then uncertainty, sometimes you're going to run into a venture capitalist who's just had a bunch of things not work out, and they might be in a very risk-averse mindset, right? And that might have nothing to do with the quality of your business, right? So just remember, VC is meeting lots and lots of companies, and don't take those no's personally is another thing I just want to remind people of. All right, so that's VCs in general. Now let's talk about the specific people you pitch. In the same way you probably prospect and research potential customers. If you're an enterprise company, you might look them up and try to figure out what they care about. I would do the same thing with VCs. Things to look at: sector. Do they care about your market in the first place? Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not. But you can kind of tell by their past track record, what they write about, what they put out there into the universe on Twitter. Spike. What can they help you with, right? Like, is this someone who can actually be useful on your cap table and on your board? Stage. Do they even get what it's like at your stage? Because I've definitely seen instances where you get someone who's a little bit more growth oriented at an early stage company, and they start to freak out. They're like, why are you, upgrading? Why has there been so much churn on the management team side versus the early stage investors? Like, you're going to upgrade your management team you're constantly changing you're going to, like, if you get someone who lasts for 2 years, that's like killing it, right? That's amazing. And so you just see this like different expectations. And so you want to make sure the stage fit is right. Especially now when I think a lot of later stage folks are coming into the seed and early stage. The question is like, will their expectations be calibrated with the reality of what it's like to be a seed or early stage company? Seniority. Is this person, an associate, a partner, a GP? And associates are not, senior does not necessarily mean better. I think there are younger people who have a lot of hustle and drive and no board seats yet, for whom you are the most important thing in their career. And that has a lot of benefits. Also, the younger partners tend to have fresher networks of talent that you can pull into. And so those are some benefits of working with like an earlier person earlier in there. I'm very grateful to, the folks who took a chance on me. When I was just starting out inside of Sequoia, I had actually built a company and exited it, but I didn't have a lot of investing reps yet, right? So then the last thing is signal. What signal does the firm send? I think this is the least important, but I will say, as someone who was backed by a top venture firm and someone who now works at Sequoia, the brand of the firm actually does help unlock doors in terms of recruiting. People might be a little bit more likely to answer your emails. It's subtle things, but I will say I think this is actually the least important of all of these. Sorry if you hear crying in the background. It's upstairs.
I also have background crying. Don't worry.
So anyway, those are some of the things that I would think of. Waseem, I don't know. Is there anything you would add here?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I would. A lot of people tend to. Here's what I would say. I would not underestimate the value of having someone who's going to actually work hard for you, and that tends to be fairly uncorrelated with the firm's brand, or maybe perhaps even anti-correlated with the firm's brand or the person's seniority. Which is, I think, one of the things that I've really most appreciated about our investors is their willingness to just put in the time, put in the effort, like when we need help with stuff. And I think there's some investors where they're down to do that, especially I think if they're earlier in a career, they still need to make a name for themselves. Like you'll find there's a greater willingness generally. So I definitely agree with your point there, Jess.
Yeah. I would like to think it's not anti-correlated for us.
Obviously, Sequoia is
But I also think looking at the pace of someone's investing, like do they do 20 investments a year and have no time for any of them? Or at Sequoia, I think each partner does 1, 2, maybe 3 investments per year, and each one of those is a really important commitment. Yeah. So do your homework ahead of time. Try to research. When you build your prospect list, take these things into account. Oh, and sometimes one thing I'll maybe add is sometimes you should still add a couple of investors to your list where it may not be super clear it's like a perfect fit. A company that I'm going to reference throughout this presentation is Ironclad, which is a digital contracting platform that I work with. I came from the world of consumer. And so me and Ironclad do not seem like an obvious fit, but Jason and I in our first meeting had great chemistry. Like we just felt really values aligned. He was so thoughtful. And I was actually a potential customer, because I was a CEO who had signed so many contracts and had dealt with contract hell. And so I got the product. And then I think what he wanted from me was someone who could help with applying the playbooks of consumer and community building and product-led viral growth to the enterprise. And something interesting about Ironclad is Ironclad has a chief community officer, which is a very rare title. But that's sort of the culmination of all of this, like apply consumer thinking to an enterprise company and lean hard into community advocacy and have a title of someone like chief community officer. So anyway, sometimes it's not always an obvious fit. So if you find someone you think is really interesting, even if you're like, well, they haven't done my sector, maybe it's okay to take a few of those meetings. All right. Sell the problem. So now this is getting into the actual pitch side of things. So I like this picture of a mountain because I think it's an apt analogy for being a founder. You're like trying to climb this arduous, like you're trying to dominate your category. You're trying to make it to the top. And it is very steep and winding, and no one has ever charted this course before. And so you are constantly going back and forth looking for, how to navigate the next crag and get up to the next ridge. And it's tough. You hope that you make it, and there's many teams climbing maybe at the same time, and you're just trying to, basically survive and not die and make it to the top. So I think about that as that was what it felt like to me when I was a founder. However, for a VC, they're not looking at your mountain, right? Their world is what's in this mountain range? Which mountain is worth climbing, And in fact, they're looking at the whole world of all mountain ranges one could possibly climb, whereas you are focused on you and beating the other teams on that mountain, right? So you're thinking, how do I make it up the mountain? Am I beating the other teams? The VC is thinking, is this a good mountain? How does this mountain compare to others? And so what you really need to do in your pitch is sell the problem you're solving, which is the mountain. It's like, this is my market. This is why it's interesting. This is why it's a good problem to solve. Not just, here's why my solution is the best solution for this problem, right? Which is kind of what you probably spend all day thinking about. But in a single day, you know, that VC will be looking at you and your business pilot, back office and, bookkeeping and accounting, versus maybe some other problem like autonomous vehicles, trucking, right? I happen to be I work with Embark Trucks, but he's been thinking, well, SaaS is and software is easier to build and roll back. Building trucks has a lot of operational intensity and hardware and different. So that's, they're not comparing you to your competitor. They're comparing you to that autonomous trucking company or that consumer social company. And so sometimes people just pass because they don't like the mountain you're solving, and you should not be offended by that, but you should just understand that selling that your mountain is a good one to climb in the first place is an extremely important part of the pitch. And it's not just the TAM, it's also sometimes the market structure, right? And the business model, right? There are some business models that are just slightly better than others. Like SaaS a lot of people like SaaS because it's an annual contract, it's recurring revenue. If you think about something like consumer packaged goods, right? Every day you start over getting a new customer and that customer pays you once and then may never come back. Versus with SaaS, you have someone going there for a year, like paying you for a year, using your product, paying up front potentially for 1 year, and then using your product for a year. And then you have that long to convince them to stay for the next year. That's just inherently so much better than, something that is like a beauty product. So those are some of the things that VCs are thinking about. I will share a couple of examples of how one can sell the problem in a few different sort of simple ways. Again, I'll go to Ironclad, and keep in mind, Ironclad now is a $3 billion valuation, really like well-known, great company. But at the time, there'd been very few companies that have actually made it in legal tech, and was kind of considered not a very interesting business. And I think a lot of people thought, oh, selling into lawyers is the worst because lawyers are the lowest on the totem pole in all of of all the people you could sell to in the enterprise. It's like engineering and sales are the best. And then, maybe finance is there. And then way below them is legal. Legal, like everyone hates the lawyers. They have no budget. Like, people don't even want lawyers at their company. It's, terrible place to build a company. So this is how Jason sold the vision for Ironclad. Every business in the world is a contracts business. Doesn't matter how big you are. Everyone is signing contracts. Every team is a contracts team, whether you're in finance, looking at like, comp plans, or you're in IT, or you're in marketing, everyone is signing contracts. But companies still make contracts like the Dark Ages. This is a picture of a painting from 1618 called The Village Lawyer that talks about how contracts were done then, and is still actually the same thing. There's a group of lawyers, there's a line of people waiting to get their contracts reviewed on pieces of paper. And the lawyer is like peering at it, trying to read it and trying to tell you, okay, this is what you need to do, and gives you back like a little piece of paper, right? That is still how contracts are done, except they're done in Microsoft Word and long email chains. And it is a pain in the ass. And every other piece of your workflow in your company has probably moved to some nice UI like bookkeeping with Pilot, or tickets in Jira or Linear. And why is law this way? And I thought that was like a really interesting way to explain that it isn't just the legal team; it affects everybody at every company. So that's 3 slides. Another great example is actually Pilot, right? This is actually from one of the early decks at Pilot. The problem, bookkeeping, similar, just the same 3 points. Everybody needs it. No one is happy. It's extremely mechanical. I'm sure Waseem would do a better job of pitching this, but I'll leave it at that. But that is, yeah. Go ahead, Waseem.
No, I agree. I mean, look, this is a problem that every business has, and the status quo is quite awful. The status quo is the same as it was, in 1980. There's someone sitting in front of a Windows machine running QuickBooks, clicking around a lot. And the problem is, it means that there's a bunch of insight that you could be getting from this stuff that you don't by virtue of the way it's being done.
Yeah. So anyway, good examples of selling the problem. All right, next, sell the dream. So remember, I grounded you in the returns, right? 3 out of 10 companies have to make up for everything else. So what the VC is thinking is on that 10-year time frame. You're thinking maybe a quarter out, like a year out, like what do I do with my company? Maybe even the next week. But VCs are thinking 10 years out. Is this one of the 20 to 50 best companies I can partner with over the next 10 years? Is this a problem space that I would be interested to work on for 10 years? Is this a founder I can see myself working with for 10 years? How will this market evolve over the next 10 years? Does this idea have enough upside to make up for the 2/3 that will likely fail, right? And so they're thinking 10 years out. So I just encourage you also to think like 10 years out. Like, is this someone that you want to work with for 10 years and get texts from for the next 10 years? But that's sort of where the VC is thinking. And because of this, you really need to sell that 10-year dream. Don't just sell, here's what I will be in 1 year and by the, what I will use my Series A for. Or here is my roadmap for the next few months. And, this is who I am today. You do need to convince the VC that this is a worthy thing for 10 years out. And so back to Ironclad. Ironclad was like, look, every single one of these other teams inside of an enterprise, from finance to HR to sales to IT or marketing, has sort of a system of engagement, a system of record that is the software they live in. And those companies are worth billions and billions of dollars. Ironclad will be that for the legal team. Even though today, at the time, it was just digital contracting, right? There's a lot of other stuff the legal team does, right? So that as a concept was sort of the last slide, right? Even though that's not where they are today, that's not at all what the rest of the presentation was about. It's just like painting a small picture of the dream. And then pilot example, Pilot takes care of your business. So it takes care of your back office so you can focus on your business. And that leaves a little room for more than just, your bookkeeping, right? There could be more. Like, what are all the other back office functions your finance team has to deal with that maybe you don't want to think about, right? So I would just encourage you to make sure you sell that dream. I would say one of the classic mistakes I see, especially from women and underrepresented minority founders, is people will make this slide with revenue projections and say, even if I screw everything up, I could still be $100 million business in 7 years. And you just got to remember, VCs are not looking to check the box on is there a likely risk of this being 100 million? They're trying to think about, what could this be, a billion-dollar company, right? And so I see, there, when you see that slide, $100 million if everything goes wrong, versus a founder that doesn't even caveat and say, this is my plan for 300 million in 5 years, or this is a multi-billion-dollar. That's just a stronger pitch, because the VC is trying to think about upside maximization, not downside minimization. You will not make the VC's career out of 10 out of 10 companies are $100 million, businesses or don't die, right? That's just not how it kind of works. All right. Last tip. You've done your pitch. You've met the right people. Now it's time to do the two-way diligence, right? It's not just, do they like you? You should, throughout your entire process, be thinking about, do you like them, right? And there are things you can do along the way. It's actually just not at the end, but, along the way, how thoughtful are their questions and feedback, right? Do they ask good questions? Do they understand your space? Are they asking really basic things? Do their questions make you think? I work with one of the partners I work with, Alfred Lin. He was CEO of Zappos and works with Airbnb and DoorDash and many others. But he has a little bit of this reputation. He'll ask a very pointed question in your meeting, and you'll be like, oh, sometimes it's like, oh, no one has ever asked me that question in one of these meetings. And then I've actually had the experience of a founder coming back years later after their first company, and they meet Alfred, and they're like, Alfred, you asked me this question, and you were right. That's either, the thing I thought about that made my company successful, or that's why we never worked. And so it's getting good questions and feedback out of VCs can be really useful for your own process and your thinking, because remember, the VC's seeing you, your competitors, everything across the landscape, and may actually have some useful thoughts. So I do think it's smart to ask for feedback. And then don't be too offended if it's not kind of what you want to hear. Just doesn't mean you don't have to listen to it, but just take it with grace and think about it. It could be totally wrong, so don't necessarily listen to it, but I think it's useful to ask. Secondly, chemistry, ease of communication, right? Waseem nailed it. Is this the person you want to get text from for 10 years, right? And there's a little bit of Do you even connect on, could you explain things the same way? Is there enough chemistry for that to be a good relationship? You can ask for examples, like, how have you helped other companies? Like, can you name an example of like something you did in the last month, right? Or like, how have you been most helpful to a company when it was failing, right? Do founder references. Actually, a good sign of a VC being really interested in you is when they all start to offer founder references before you've gotten a term sheet. That's like means they're pretty interested. But I would definitely do the founder references. And then again, go back to that wish list that you wrote after the know thyself thing. Like, how do they match against that? Like, really think about that along the way. Waseem, and I don't know, any tips from you on this stuff?
I mean, I'm big on founder references. Like, there's no substitute for talking to people who've actually worked with the investor before. And I find that in general, like, founders tend to be candid with other founders about, what worked well, what worked poorly. And I think this is like, when you're doing a reference check on anyone, but especially an investor, especially an executive, like, no one is perfect. Everyone has some areas of improvement. And if you haven't like heard what those are yet, you probably haven't dug deeply enough. So I'd encourage you not to be like, oh yeah, they're great, you should work with them. It's like, cool, but if you could change something, what would you change? Or what has been maybe the most frustrating part, or maybe like, what is the part that hasn't gone as well as you'd hoped? Because again, you're trying to go into this with eyes open, and you have to understand that no one is perfect. And so better to go in knowing the strengths and limitations or the potential pitfalls than discovering them after the fact.
Yeah, I think there are some things that are like a minimum threshold that you need to meet, like some level of values alignment, obviously integrity, and then there are going to be some things where this person spikes, your investor spikes, and can really help you. And there's going to be some things maybe they don't know, right? And so I'll always be grateful to Jason at Ironclad. Like, I didn't know much about enterprise SaaS sales teams and how to run a sales team. I've learned a ton since then, but I was really helpful on maybe the community and consumer playbook side of things and product-led growth. And he already had other great investors. Steve Laughlin's on the board, who's fantastic at from Excel, who's like great at enterprise SaaS and ran a SaaS company before. So, just the combination, think about that board team that you're building out as well. So that's it for my 5 tips. Think about it as founder investor fit. Sell, know yourself, know your customer, sell the problem, sell the dream, and do your 2-way diligence. And so I hope you all live long and prosper with your chosen partner.
Thank you, Jess. And with that, we've got a pretty robust set of questions submitted in the Q&A tool. And so if folks have more questions, please feel free to go submit over there. And let's just start working through those, if that sounds good to you.
Sure.
And I think if you stop sharing your screen, I'll be able to actually show the question live online too, which will be kind of slick.
I will do that. There we go.
Okay, so let's take a look at this question from Victoria. We've no difficulty in attracting investors, but everyone is waiting for the lead. Does that mean that the attraction of our investors isn't strong enough and they want to take a ride on other people's due diligence? And as a way of background, we're a deep tech seed stage startup. Any thoughts for us here, I guess?
Yeah. It kind of depends on the firms you're talking to. There are some firms that like really prefer to be the lead. And there are some that like kind of don't. And so if it's true that all the firms that you're speaking with are like the kind that don't lead, like maybe they're all angels or scouts, right? Or family offices, then yeah, that could be why. It could be because they really just don't lead. But if there are big funds in there that often do lead, I think that could be a signal of like, there's something they don't like about your company. And I would do the digging to figure out what.
Yeah, kind of +1 on that. I mean, I think that there's a challenge. There's definitely a stereotype, and I think it has some accuracy to it in the venture community, where there tends to be a lot of following and not a lot of leading. I don't mean here formally. It's just people get excited when they see other people are excited. And I think one of the signs that you've really found someone who you're going to be excited to work with over the decade-plus journey is, do they have that conviction in you, your business, your industry? And if they really just want to be like the follower because someone else gets excited, that's actually probably not the type of partner that's going to serve you well on the journey. And so it's frustrating that they're not willing to commit, but it's also probably in some ways perversely a good thing, because it prevents you from getting into business with someone who doesn't really like have that belief in the idea and the team and the opportunity. Because again, not to opine on this at overly great length, the question is not, are your investors going to be helpful when things are going great? The question in some ways is inevitably when things do not go as planned, like how much do the investors believe in the team and the mission and the opportunity, and how excited are they going to be to really back you? And I think that same conviction is the same conviction that leads to someone kind of taking the plunge and being open to leading. I don't know, Jess, if you have any reactions to that.
I totally agree. I think how someone acts in the bad times is the most important thing. And that'll go much better if they've always fundamentally believed in you and in the mission of the company.
Sure. Here's another question from our audience. Do you invest more in founders or ideas? How do you think about that from the investor perspective, or maybe from your perspective, Jess? What makes for, like, do one of these weigh more than the other?
They're both important, but I would say founder, like it also varies by stage, right? Like if it's a pre-seed or seed stage company, you know that there's a lot of flexibility. There isn't much there yet, so you can always change the idea. And so a lot of it is it's much more founder oriented. But when you get to later stage, right? Like if you're a Series D stage company, the product's baked and it's a lot of work even to unwind the idea in the first place. So I would say founder matters the entire way, right? Absolutely. But ideas matter, right? I think choice of idea is also a reflection of the founder. But as you get later, a great, product market fit, great metrics start to matter maybe more. Yeah.
Makes sense. Okay, let's take a look at what else we've got here. Another question.
Maybe I will share really, actually, now that I think about it, I work with a company called moss.com. It is a neobank for Gen Z and students, but it did not start that way. And this is a Series A investment. The founder, Amira, is a human rights activist. She's amazing. She was one of the people behind the Arab Spring revolution on Twitter, and sort of her actions led to the overthrowing of the government in Tunisia. And she ran a 600-person NGO that helped rewrite the constitution. So in another world, completely separate from tech, she is a highly accomplished person. She'd never run a tech company. She doesn't have a college degree. She's now running a neobank. But the idea actually started as an ed tech idea. And so when we first partnered, I remember I was like, this is one of the most special people I will ever meet. And ed tech is a very tough space. And this business model has severe TAM limitations. And that's in my memo. But I still championed very hard for that investment. And it turns out the TAM limitation did, we pivoted, we leveraged what we had built to build a bank where the primary feature is now, what was the ed tech business? It helps you find financial aid. And think about that, a bank that gets you money. Oh, that's pretty interesting value for all. So anyway, that's an example of where even at the Series A, sometimes like the most amazing founder, like sort of just, you bet on that. Yeah.
Makes sense. Another question from our audience. How do you show a 3x or a 10x return when you're at the seed stage and your projections are mostly on your vision and your assumptions? You mentioned, Jess, totally correctly that, your VC investors are looking for these 10, 100x, 1000x, 10,000x opportunities. In the early days, you sort of can't really prove that in some way. How do you think you should go about kind of making the case there?
Yeah. So one way is with a TAM slide, right? And you want a TAM that's like ideally double-digit billions, because everyone knows you only get max 10%, or not everyone, but like it's rare for someone to get more than 10% of their TAM. There are certain places where it does happen, like marketplaces where there's strong network effects, but you take the TAM, and I think a VC is kind of like max 10%. and then wants that to be still a multi-billion-dollar number so that it can be a public company. So that's some of the math. You may have to do a little bit of storytelling to show how you could actually own the whole TAM, the whole SAM, maybe, I guess, like maybe you do a slice of that market today. You have to kind of paint this picture of like, you will be the be all end all of this user in this market. That's one way to do it. The other way I think is to do the couple of examples that I showed from Ironclad and Pilot, which is from a user perspective. And you just kind of know, like, there are a lot of users who have this problem. Here's how many of them there are. And you don't even have to do the actual math. You just say, everyone needs bookkeeping. Everyone hates it. Everyone needs something like this. Everyone signs contracts. So that's maybe another example. Yeah. But I would not actually, you don't have to necessarily do all the math, but you just need to show this is a big enough mountain. Yeah.
Yeah, totally agreed, which is, again, the TAM acronym stands for total addressable market. In some ways, the question is like, if this thing is successful, how big could it really be? And that's a little bit of a counterintuitive way of thinking about it. As Jess noted, I think some of the things that a lot of first-time founders or kind of early in the process founders do is they say, well, look, even if it doesn't go well, it's still going to be of size X. And in some ways, the question is, if everything goes according to your wildest expectations, how big could it be? Because if that number is not big enough, then it sort of doesn't matter. It's actually not a very venture fundable business. Because even if in the best, most wild case scenario, it's a $500 million business, well, that's actually just not compatible with the model for venture capital. And again, I just, as an aside here, venture capital is not the only way to fund your business or to grow a business. There are lots of great businesses that have been built bootstrapping or via, alternative structures. So don't think that like, oh, just because I couldn't raise VC, I wasn't, I'm not an awesome founder or whatever. But the venture capital model requires businesses of a particular shape. And so I think it's important to know and understand, does my business fit this shape? And if it does, okay, maybe I'm a good candidate for VC. And if I don't, then I'm not. And again, that's not a bad thing.
Totally. We actually have a section in the Sequoia memos. There's a section called the pre-parade and the pre-mortem. It's kind of like if you think about the post-mortem, the pre-mortem is like, what would happen? What's the most likely reason this company could, not work out? I mean, what's the scenario? Paint the picture. Then the more important part is the pre-parade. Dream about what if everything went right, and then you write a series of events of like how it could, become the thing it becomes.
Yeah. Okay, let's take a look at the next one here. And thank you folks for kind of keeping the Q&A going here. We've got a bunch in the tool, which is terrific. At the pre-seed level, we've seen some weird decrease in interest after launch, given small traction, rather than before when it was just an idea or MVP. Do you see traction as a deterrent to getting pre-seed funding? When should you do your first raise? Or maybe to ask the question a little bit differently, one of the pieces of advice I've sometimes heard is, in some ways, having no revenue or no traction is better than having just a little bit of traction, because you're kind of leaving it up to the imagination. Do you think that's true? I mean, you have deep consumer expertise here too, Jess, in a way that I don't. How do you tend to think about, when you see metrics and stuff from founders, how they should best tell their story?
Yeah, it is easier to, as soon as there's data, people are going to jump on it and try to analyze it and look for patterns. I think that's just kind of normal. And so I think you do need to think about whether the data you present is, or whether when to time your fundraise around that. That said, I think raising too early is actually really bad for your company. Raising too late is obviously bad. So I wouldn't let it be the primary driver. Like, I would not pull your fundraising in unnecessarily, months earlier, if only because you just want to make sure you don't have, it's pre-launch and pre-data. The best position to raise in, obviously, is you actually have data and the data is really good. So you just need to think about how much do you believe, how likely is it to work, when was it likely to work, how much time does it need for you to iterate to get to the point where the numbers look good, and then think about that in the grand scheme of when to fundraise.
Yeah, to add to that, I think one of the things that I frequently tell people is, look, the best way to raise, the two best ways to raise money are, one is not to need money, and the second is to actually build like a successful company. And that sounds cheeky, but the point is, I don't think you should hyper optimize how you run your business to tell a good story to investors. You should optimize your business for building a successful business. Now, having said that, look, this is a pitch of the head and the heart, and so I would give some thought to the storytelling aspect of how am I going to tell my narrative in a way that makes it seem compelling. But to Jess's point, that would not be the thing that caused me to do something unnatural simply for the sake of being able to tell the story. Okay, another question from our audience, and this is one actually I know very little bit about. Jess, maybe you can help us out here. I don't know if you do or not. For social impact ventures, are there spaces you'd recommend to connect with investors who deeply value social impact returns alongside financial returns? Or maybe more generally, I'm curious to get your take broadly on these kind of social impact companies and how you folks tend to think about them.
Yeah. So if you have a shot of your company being like a venture scale business, I don't think you should go look specifically only for social impact investors. Like, having a great mission and doing good in the world is a great way to keep employees motivated. And it's just like good to, I particularly have invested in a lot of very, very mission driven companies. I work with Otter, which, solves the childcare crisis. And if done well, like could really change, allow for economic mobility, right? So same with Moss. It's about empowering, it's financial empowerment. So I don't know if I would pick necessarily like you have to go find out who are the social impact investors. I think there's a lot of way to do good and also make money. Like climate change, as an example, used to be like, oh, it's this nice to have thing. It's not a nice to have thing. Like that's probably one of the biggest economic opportunities of our time is solving climate change, because we have to, and consumers care about it, and businesses have to care about it, and there's emission standards and regulation driving it. So it kind of depends on exactly what your company is. But I would say if you can find the angle that is a good business, but is also mission driven, that's actually a wonderful thing that will give you advantages over tons of other companies. And you should just go for investors who genuinely care about that thing, but are also just, great investors. Yeah.
I have a somewhat similar, but maybe it's a kind of depressing articulation of it, which is, I think in general, it is challenging to try to do two things at the same time. And I think consequently, it's hard for investors and it's hard for business owners. If your goal is if your principal objective is, I'm aiming to produce this social good in the world, I think that can sometimes be at odds with, I'm interested in, starting a business that can be dramatically profitable. I think if you can find a way to tightly couple those, that's terrific. Obviously, it can be a very powerful force. I think it can be hard for investors putting their hat on. Are we a financially motivated investor? Or are we kind of social impact oriented investor? So I found that it is always a little bit tough a space to navigate in, though again, it's not really my area of expertise.
I run I'm one of the co-founders of a nonprofit called All Raise, and All Raise is allraise.org, and it's dedicated to diversity in tech. And I think there are a lot of organizations out there that took the you have to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do sort of angle. And we decided to take the, All Raise. It is about, we often talk about, greed is just as good of a motivator as, or a better motivator than fear. Like if you back great women and, you will, women founders will have unique insights into female customers. Female customers are 50% of customers, control 80% of household purchasing power, drive 80% of healthcare decisions. And so that's actually just good for business. And so I do think if you want to solve a social problem, I think figuring out the economic angle can be really, really powerful, which is another reason I always think about that with Otter. I'm like, what are the things? Otter specifically matches parents who need childcare with stay-at-home parents, right? And stay-at-home parents, often stay-at-home moms, are doing all this unpaid labor for the workforce. And if you could get stay-at-home moms to take on one extra kid from their neighborhood and give them that economic empowerment, they become a breadwinner in their household. And then it'll be more affordable for the women who are currently not having careers And because childcare is so expensive, like childcare is like unaffordable 50% of Americans. That's actually potentially one of the most empowering things I could work on for women, but also happens to be a great business idea. So sometimes you can find both. So I would just encourage you to, if you can find the economic angle that also does good, I think that's really powerful.
You said that about 1,000 times better than I said it. I guess that's 100% the point I was trying to make, which is ideally like the place where your happy place is when those things really are aligned and move in lockstep. Okay, we got a question from Mike here. If you have a lead investor, how do you get aligned on expectations or what's needed from additional investors that they might bring in or intro you to? I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, but maybe you can talk a little bit about kind of like round composition once you've found a lead. Jess?
Yeah. What I like to actually talk about this with founders beforehand. I ask them like, how are you thinking about this round? What are you looking for? Like, what are the holes you're trying to fill or gaps that you have? And then I start in advance thinking of like, who are potential co-investors or people I could introduce them to from my network or from the Sequoia network. And sometimes they even show you a list of those people like ahead of time and talk it through maybe even before term sheets signed. But I would definitely do that process together. But again, you have to know thyself and think about like, what are your actual gaps? Like, do you need celebrity connections? Do you need, I don't know, enterprise CIO intros, right? And so you just think strategically about all of that and then talk it through, I would say, with your investor. And I would do it actually. I highly recommend doing a dinner before you sign a term sheet. You get to see someone in the casual environment. You can really feel out the chemistry in a more low-key vibe. And then you can talk through some of these things, and it's almost like a little working session. Like, how do we think about co-investors? And you get to see, how do they react to you explaining what you're great at and where you need help? How do they react to, do they actually immediately have thoughtful ideas, or they're like, yeah, okay, and then no help at all? You'll learn a lot that way. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Another question from our audience, and we're getting close to time here, so I'm going to move fast. What's the best way to reframe a narrative if the common feedback is the TAM of the initial revenue stream is too small? We've attempted to show a phased approach to revenue generation that gets us easily to a venture scale business, but everyone gets hung up on the initial revenue stream being too small of a market. And this is actually related to another question in the chat, which is there's a, let me try to find the notes here. There's a company in our chat that they make like a contraception product for women. Do they talk about the TAM as being like the condom industry, or do they talk about the TAM as being like the sexual wellness industry entirely? And the difference there is like 10 billion versus 125 billion. So I guess maybe thoughts generally on how to frame up TAM with the understanding that there's like the current stuff and there's like the future stuff.
Yeah. So for consumer, you often just, I think, try to explain it really simply about who's the user and that there's a lot of them, right? So my company was in women's fashion. I cannot tell you how many people were like, oh, women's fashion, like that's really small, or that's not that interesting. And so, I did two things. I would say, well, 50% of humans are women and 100% of us wear clothes, right? So it's kind of obvious. And then the other thing was I would take fashion magazines, right? Like a thick stack of fashion magazines, and I would bring them to the meeting. And then to sort of wake everyone up, I would throw them on the table dramatically and say, this one issue of the September issue of Vogue makes $100 million of ad revenue in September. Boom. Imagine that on the internet. That unfortunately is no longer true, but that was the trick. Sometimes you have to resort to these parlor tricks, but that's kind of how, you think about like VC's like comparison points. So they're always like, after they talk to you, they're like, what is the biggest company in this space? How much revenue have they ever got to? And they think about that company as a comparable. And is that big enough? Is that too small? Why is that too small? How will this be different? So that's kind of what's happening behind the scenes as they're doing the diligence. So I think grounded in the consumer, for this contraception, like, sometimes you can actually just say, instead of pulling numbers on the sides of the contraceptive market, you almost ground in the user, like almost everyone has sex. Almost everyone wishes they were having more sex. Like, this is why people don't, or whatever it might be like that. That's like maybe one example.
Sure. Thanks. And then final question, because I know we're kind of at time here. We talked a lot about the sort of the founder investor matchmaking process. A question from our audience. what's the best way to find prospective investors so that you can weed out the ones that won't be a good fit? Any thought on kind of investor discovery, or maybe how you'd recommend going about that process?
Yeah, well, if the fund's doing a good job, they will have a website with a list of the partners that you can just peruse and kind of get a sense of who they are and what their prior investments are. And looking at the prior investments will give you a sense of maybe what sectors. If you go through their blog, you'll see like who blogs about what kind of stuff. Go through the Twitters of those investors. I think an efficient way to, you can work backwards from like looking for on like VC Twitter or VC mediums for people who are interested in your sector, or people who've invested in maybe not direct competitors, but in companies that are kind of around that space. Like who's done, if you're telemedicine, who's done any telemed, right? Like, although some, I've done 2 healthcare companies, only one is telemed. So you might not know right away, but yeah, that's sort of how, that's probably how I would approach it.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, Jess, thank you so much for the time, and folks who tuned in, thank you all for joining. We had a great session today. I really appreciate you all spending some time with us, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks again, Jess.
Yeah, thanks for having me.